Just before sunrise, a barge rocked quietly off the Florida coast. Workers stood at the edge with shovels, pushing a heavy pile overboard. It hit the water and sank into the dark below. Then another load, then another. The smell was unbearable, thick, sour, the kind that sticks to your clothes and stays in your nose long after you leave. These were not clean materials being carefully placed into the water. These were rotting oyster shells scraped off restaurant plates, clamshells pulled off processing lines, bits of flesh still clinging to the surface. Waste, all of it, being dumped by the truckload into the Gulf of Mexico. Over the next 17 years, Florida would dump more than 500,000 tons of this material into the water, 500,000 tons of what most people would call garbage. Critics called it reckless. Fishermen said it would finish off an ecosystem already on its knees. Environmental groups warned it could bury what little life remained on the seafloor. And for a long time, it looked like they were all right. But beneath the surface, something impossible had quietly begun. To understand why this happened, you have to understand how bad things had gotten. Florida's oyster population had collapsed by more than 90%. In places like Apalachicola Bay, once one of the most productive oyster regions in the entire country, the system was breaking apart in real time. The core problem was simple and brutal. Oysters cannot survive without a hard surface to attach to when they're young. Rock, old shells, anything solid. Without it, larvae drift until they die. And in large parts of the Gulf, that hard surface was gone. The original reefs had been harvested, broken down, and buried over decades of commercial fishing. The seafloor had gone soft and empty. The survival rate for oyster larvae in those waters had fallen to somewhere between 2 and 5%. Out of every 100 larvae, only 2 made it. That is not a struggling system. That is a system in freefall. And the damage didn't stop with oysters. Without them filtering the water, excess nutrients from farms and cities built up unchecked. That fueled explosive algae growth, blooms that blocked sunlight, choked out marine life, and stripped oxygen from the water. Fish lost their shelter and their breeding grounds. Entire stretches of the Gulf went quiet. One fisherman, whose family had worked those waters for generations, described it plainly. "We're dying," he said. "The water quality is dying from 1,000 little cuts, and then we have one big gash in the middle." The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission knew the window to act was closing, so they came up with a plan that sounded, on paper, almost laughably simple. Put the shells back. The logic was direct. Those discarded shells, the same ones being scraped off plates and hauled out of seafood plants, were exactly what the seafloor was missing. Hard surfaces, landing pads for drifting larvae. If enough of them could be placed in the right areas, oysters might attach, grow, reproduce, and slowly rebuild what had been lost. The irony was sharp. The shells came from the same industry that had helped strip the reefs in the first place. For decades, oyster shells were pulled out of the water, sold, and discarded, never returned. Now they were being collected from restaurants and waste bins and sent back to where they came from. But the project had a serious problem in its early stages. There were no underwater cameras, no reliable way to track what was happening below. Teams were dropping massive amounts of material into water they could not observe. For months, the entire operation was blind. When monitoring teams returned about 18 months later, they expected to confirm failure. They lowered their equipment, looked down, and saw exactly what you would expect to see after dumping 500,000 tons of shells into open water. Pale mounds, sitting motionless on a flat, empty seafloor. No fish, no movement, no visible sign of anything living. They recorded it as inactive and went home. They were looking at the wrong scale, because underneath those shells, something had already started. Something too small to see, too early to measure, and too important to miss. The first life to arrive was not fish, it was not oysters, it was bacteria. Within days of the shells hitting the seafloor, microscopic bacteria had begun attaching themselves to the surface. They organized into thin structured layers called biofilms, essentially a living skin spreading across each shell. From above, it looked like dead material. Underneath, it was already an active growing system. This matters because that microbial layer is the foundation for almost every complex marine ecosystem on Earth. Before fish, before reefs, before anything visible, there is always this thin, invisible layer building the groundwork. Scientists have spent years trying to recreate this process in laboratories. Here, it was happening naturally, triggered by discarded restaurant waste. Oyster shells also began changing the water around them. Made primarily from calcium carbonate, the shells slowly dissolved and released tiny amounts of calcium into the surrounding water. This created small pockets of unique chemistry, called microzones, that gave young organisms exactly the conditions they needed to attach and grow. The shell was not just a surface, it was actively making itself easier to live on. Then came diatoms and microalgae, tiny plant-like organisms that settled into the biofilm and created the first real food source in that space. After them came microscopic crustaceans, larval shellfish, creatures barely visible even under a lens. They fed on the algae. Then slightly larger organisms fed on them. A food chain was assembling itself, from the bottom up, in total darkness, with nobody watching. And from above, it still looked like nothing. Funding reviews started. Questions were raised. The project almost died during this phase because there was no visible proof of success. The structure was there, building quietly beneath the surface, but no one could see it yet. Then, within the first year, the first visible sign arrived. Juvenile oysters in clusters, not trickles, were attaching to the shells in large numbers. They grew. By year 2, they were adults, reproducing, releasing new larvae into the water. And this time, there was somewhere for those larvae to land. A second generation attached to the first, then a third. The reef was building itself. By year 3, survey data showed approximately 847 oysters packed into a single cubic meter of shell, a space roughly the size of a small box. For context, a damaged natural reef in those same waters might hold a few dozen in that space. These new sites were holding hundreds. And then Captain Mike Lenz stood on his boat over one of the reef sites and looked down. He had opposed the project. He had spoken against it publicly, convinced it would destroy the fishing grounds his family had worked for generations. But standing there in 2013, he saw something he had not seen in 25 years on that water. Fish, stacked up in large numbers around the structure, moving in tight groups, feeding in the current. He said it simply, "I was wrong. I've never seen fish stack up like that in 25 years on this water." What followed that moment made the data even harder to dismiss. When divers went down and later when full surveys were completed, total marine biomass in the reef areas had increased by more than 340% compared to nearby areas with no shells. The number of different species had jumped by nearly 280%. But the real finding wasn't just that fish had shown up, it was where they came from. Most artificial reef projects attract fish by concentrating them, pulling them in from surrounding areas. The total number in the region doesn't actually increase, they just gather in one place. That is not what was happening here. The data showed large numbers of juvenile fish that were born there. The reefs weren't attracting life, they were producing it. Redfish, sheep's head, flounder, snook, each one filling a role, each one strengthening the system. And then came the ones nobody expected, species that had not been recorded in those specific parts of the Gulf in over 2 decades. Red snapper, under strict limits due to population collapse, began appearing around these reefs, outside any management plan, outside any prediction. Then came octopuses, then sea turtles, then dolphins. And dolphins do not appear unless the food supply and water conditions can sustain them. When they appeared, regularly hunting along the reef edges, it meant something fundamentally had shifted. The system was working. But the most staggering part of the story wasn't the fish, it was the water. A single oyster filters between 30 and 50 gallons of water every single day. It pulls water in, removes excess nutrients, particles, and harmful bacteria, and releases cleaner water out the other side. Now, scale that up. Hundreds of thousands of oysters, then millions, all filtering simultaneously across these reef sites. The numbers become almost impossible to process. Entire reef systems pushing billions of gallons of filtered water back into the Gulf every day. No machinery, no energy input, no maintenance cost, just living organisms doing what they naturally do. The impact was measurable. Oxygen levels rose, nutrient levels dropped. The water became clearer enough for sunlight to reach depths it hadn't in years. That triggered seagrass regrowth. Seagrass stabilized the sediment, which kept the water clearer, which allowed more seagrass to grow. The system locked itself into a self-reinforcing loop. The filtration value of those reefs was later estimated at tens of millions of dollars. Building a mechanical system to do the same job would cost hundreds of millions and require constant operation. The oysters were doing it for free.